My name is Craig Kahlke from Cornell Cooperative Extension's Lake Ontario Fruit Team. I welcome you to our Western New York Petal Fall Thinning meeting. It is graciously sponsored by Jim Bittner with the New York State Hort Society, and we really appreciate their sponsorship. And before we turn the program over to Terence to give you thinning recommendations, I'm going to give Jim the floor.
I'm on the silo work group as a bunch of ag representatives that meet with different New York State departments to talk about ag issues. In June, we are having a meeting at the PEC office in Albany. The topics are going to include food waste, pesticides, deer and wildlife, ag water withdrawal, issues like that. If anyone has specific issues that I should be bringing up to PEC, please get them to me. This is a great forum to get things taken care of. Other thing, on Wednesday, Craig is going to be posting some links in the chat. On Wednesday at noon, there is a union basics for farm workers in Spanish. A great idea to get your Spanish-speaking farm workers to get onto that Zoom call, find out ins and outs of unionization, what's going on in New York State, make sure that they have their eyes wide open when somebody comes to them with a union card. The other link is for the Farm Worker Relief Fund. It's money from the USDA. Anyone who's worked on a farm as a frontline worker during COVID can get a $600 check, tax-free. All they got to do is fill out the form. We're sending people to that link because there are a number of organizations that are authorized to hand that money out. Quite frankly, most of them we don't trust, including the United Farm Workers are handing the money out. We're using this group called PASA. It's a Pennsylvania Sustainable Agricultural Working Group. They're trustworthy. Their website is great. If a person can't figure it out, they can always just call in. They have Spanish-speaking people on the phone, and they can take care of getting the application done. And they're a very competent group and someone we can trust. So those are three things I wanted to mention: EEC, the Spanish Farm Worker Unionization talk on Wednesday, and the Farm Worker Relief Fund. That you really, it's to your advantage to get your workers headed in the right direction. It's their money; they're allowed to get it. Rather you send them in the right direction and they get hoodwinked by some group we don't trust. Thank you very much. And Craig had my contact information. If anybody's got any comments or questions, call me anytime. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. And I'll keep putting those links and your contact information in the chat. Just want to remind people to scroll down to the bottom of the screen and mute yourself. I have to play police here and mute people who join and don't realize they're muted. It interrupts the rest of the group. We like to have the meeting format because we do like folks to be able to ask questions and see who's on. So with that, I will turn it over to Terence to give you the most awaited thinning recommendations. Thank you, Terence.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be back with you talking about thinning. This meeting is going to focus only on the questions at hand, bloom and petal fall thinning. We're planning to have a separate meeting for the 10 to 12 millimeter spray timing in person at somebody's orchard, west of the city and east of the city. But we decided to do this one by Zoom to get everybody on the same page as we head into petal fall. I also want to just give a small caveat at the beginning that it's difficult to time this meeting perfectly because there's such a difference in bloom development this year between orchards right along the lake and those more inland. So for you people who have orchards right along the lake, this timing is early, but it's probably just about right for those orchards that are inland. To start with, I wanted to just give a small review of what we're trying to accomplish here with this meeting. We're focusing on those types of sprays that are applied at bloom. We generally use a pollen tube growth model and try to time those sprays around 60%. And I'll talk a little more in a second about that. But the second thing is what happens at petal fall. And here we're trying to time the sprays when the fruits get to about 5 to 6, basically 6 millimeters. And that happens when we've accumulated about 110 to 130 degree days after bloom. We utilize a carbon balance model that was developed by Alan Laxo to help us guide the decisions of what dose and when to put it on. But we also then use the fruit growth rate model to determine the combined impact of any sprays put on at bloom and at petal fall to help us make decisions, informed decisions on what to do when the fruits are bigger, 10 to 13 millimeters. I wanted to give a short summary of how I've seen this season develop. It seemed to me that green tip, which was in early April, was not too early. But then we had a really unusual warm period about a week after green tip, in which temperatures went into the high 70s and 80s. And that really pushed the buds fast between green tip and pink. But since pink, temperatures have really cooled down, and we've had a very slow development through pink, early pink, regular pink, full pink, such that most blocks didn't get into early bloom until the first few days of May or after the first week of May. As bloom developed, it seemed like that in most blocks, bloom was pretty good. There's small amounts of damage in some blocks, and we'll caution about those in a few minutes with some data from Mario and Craig and Liz T. Full bloom happened on the earliest inland sites around May 6th and has not been completed yet on some orchards near the lake, which will be in a couple of days. It seems like in the first part of the bloom period, bee activity was very poor. It was too cold, bees didn't fly, but certainly this week, we've had pretty decent temperatures and pretty good bee flight. So I expect to have really good pollination and fertilization and early fruit set. One of the great blessings this year has been almost no frost. The temperatures have just been wonderful for us so far. Now, there's such a disparity in bloom development. I wanted to comment briefly about the use of caustic thinners at bloom. For orchards that are south of 104, they're already pretty much past the bloom thinning with ATS window. If you have an orchard south of 104, you should be applying the second spray of ATS or applying it very soon. I show here a graph, however, of an orchard north of 104, in which it looks like we just are getting to the point of the first ATS spray for orchards north of 104, or those certainly close to the lake. So if you're close to the lake, there's still time for you to get going today or tomorrow or the day after that and spray your first ATS spray, with the second ATS spray a few days after that next week. For those further away from the lake, we're already at the close end of that window. But if you decided not to apply caustic thinners during bloom, there is still time to apply a hormone type thinner at bloom today or tomorrow. And the two options are really NAA or NAD. Both, when applied at bloom, have given good responses in terms of return bloom. It's interesting, in the last 5 years, we've had much more resurgence of NAD. They're both very safe thinners. Some people in the past have been a little afraid of acid at NAA, but my experience is that at bloom time, it's very safe, even at the 10 part per million, which is 4 ounces per 100. So it can be sprayed safely at that relatively high rate during bloom. We have shown that it helps improve return bloom on Honeycrisp. NAD is also very safe, maybe even safer, and could be sprayed at relatively high rates, 8 to 10 ounces per 100. So if you have chosen not to apply any caustic thinning sprays this year, then I would suggest you go out this afternoon or tomorrow and spray either NAA at 4 ounces or NAD at 8 to 10 ounces per 100 gallons of spray. We've already had an earlier meeting on bloom thinning, so I'm not going to talk much more about that, because this meeting's primary purpose is to gear us up for the petal fall spray. So with that, I'd like to switch to talking about the stage of development of fruits at this point in time. This is data that Craig Kahlke collected yesterday at various locations in Niagara County. And you can see that the average fruit size was for early varieties like Ginger Gold and Ida Red was 5 to 5.5, and early varieties like New York 2, Ruby Frost 5.5, and Zestar. But many other varieties in the more traditional timing are still in full bloom. And so the fruit size is 3 millimeters. It's really small still. Now that was an inland Niagara orchard. If you go down, well, there's an intermediate blocks there. But if you go down to the lake sites in Niagara, we still have some places only the Kings open. And for the early varieties like Ginger Gold, New York 2, you know, early petal fall, but we're still not at petal fall. So this range of development gives us a lot of different situations to consider, and each person has to try to consider their own. We also have some data that Liz T collected in Orleans County, at Pettit's and at Lamont's. Generally, the varieties are 4 to 5, exception Pizzazz is smaller. But if you get closer to the lake in Stillwater, then you're 3 to 5, 4 to 5 in some cases. There's not a huge difference between Kings and laterals in her measurements, because I think it's the way bloom developed. It was so cool, and they developed so slowly between pink and full bloom that the laterals were able to get out there just about as quick as the Kings did. And their fruit size is very similar at this point in time. Now, we expect that there to be a big differentiation in size as we move forward, because the Kings are more vascular connections and will grow faster. We also have this data Mario collected today, I think, early this morning, at various locations in Wayne County. The most inland site at Appleshed has Kings as big as 6 to 7 on Ida Red. Ruby Frost is an early blooming variety, with Kings around 5. Many of the other varieties are 4 to 4 to 5, and Honeycrisp around 5. But as you move closer to the lake, and look at Beckons, and then go to Vanderwalls, and then Cherry Lawn, and then DeMarie on the main farm, very close to the lake, you see that the King diameters are smaller. And if you look in the last column, Mario listed what % petal fall we are at. If you go back up to Fairville, a couple of the early varieties are essentially at petal fall, 100% of the petals off. But other varieties are still blooming, particularly blooming on 1-year wood. And certainly Romes that we know are late, they're still blooming. As you get closer to the lake and you go to 104 region around Alton and Sodus, and then you progress closer to the lake to the DeMarie main farm, there's essentially no petal fall up along the lake yet. So we're still looking forward and trying to predict what you should be doing. But for those inland sites, we're getting fairly close to needing to think about the petal fall spray. So I appreciate the Lake Ontario team for getting these measurements. They're just hot off the press, and hopefully will help you get a sense of where you are on your farm. I wanted to put up here a figure of the carbohydrate balance model from SOTUS. Essentially, the Ferber weather station gave us this. I want to point out a couple of things on what's happened. If you look at the green tip, which is in April, I think I put April 11th or 12th here, we start with a quite serious deficit because this is about the time of the heat wave. And so it's not usual to have this kind of deficit at green tip, but we had it this year and that pushed us along. But as we got over here closer to the end of April, it got cool. And then there was very little deficit, mild deficit for a period in the last few days of April. But then we got into that pink period where then it stayed cool and bees didn't fly. We were essentially no deficit, zero balance. Trees had enough carbohydrates to keep the fruits growing, even though they really weren't growing very much because it was so cold. But then we got into the warmer temperatures of this week. And so we've had this week a little deficit. I put bloom here on the 9th of May. Maybe you would quibble, it should be later or slightly earlier for your farm. But you can see that in that period of full bloom, when 80% of the flowers are open, we had a mild deficit. I want you to notice it's only about -8 grams. That's not any particular big deficit to worry about. But it was, so if you applied ATS or even NAA or NAD at full bloom, you had the benefit of this little bit of deficit to help you. But now as we move forward between the next couple of days, today and the next couple of days, the temperatures are going to cool down and we're not going to have a deficit. I'm predicting petal fall for the bulk of the area will be somewhere next week, Monday through Friday or Saturday of next week. And over that whole period of time, temperatures are predicted to be in the mid 60s, nothing even 70. And so that's going to create a problem in terms of thinning response. It should be very, very mild thinning response. This is the table off the carbohydrate model that I took off of NUA for the same Alton soda site at Ferber's. And I want you to notice here, we're today, May 12th, 80 degrees, wonderful, that's great. It does produce a negative deficit of about -30 for a day, but that's coupled by very mild deficits on either side, so that the 6-day average is not that great of a deficit. But the problem is, as we look forward, it's going to be 65, 54, 63, 59, 52 up through middle of next week. And if you look on AccuWeather beyond that, it's going to stay in the mid 60s. So that's going to give us basically positive carbohydrate balance, maybe some days around 0, but it's going to result in very mild thinning. So the color of these squares on the carbohydrate model relates to this scale up here at the top. If it's blue, you can expect mild thinning. So as far as the eye can see, we're going to expect very mild thinning, nothing that's going to be really good thinning or even excessive. I also want you to notice in the next to the last column is the degree day accumulation. So I just threw in, for interesting purposes, May 9th earlier this week. And you can see that we would, even by midweek next week, on Tuesday, we will still not reach the 100-degree days when we would suspect to put on petal fall thinners. So I'm expecting that 100, assuming you put full bloom on May 9th, will be reached on Wednesday, May 18th. And then we'll have to look at what the model says then and determine what kind of thinning we will do. But at the moment, it looks like that it's going to require high rates, and we would have a very low risk of over thinning. So in summarizing that, I first want to give this caveat that it's still too early to assess fruit set in Western New York. Now, we had really cool temperatures in the early part of bloom, little bee flight, but we've had wonderful temperatures this week and good bee flight, and I expect that there will be very good fruit set. But the temperatures following bloom will be mild in the mid 60s. I wish they were the mid 70s, but we will have to deal with that. But nevertheless, I think that because of a relatively good bloom, a relatively good set, I'm expecting really good set, that this petal fall spray will be a very essential component of your thinning program. And I think it calls for a full dose of either NAA +7 or NAD +7. And either one of those work about equally well at petal fall. Certainly with NAD, it's a higher rate than with NAA, but each at their maximum rates will work quite well. Now, but we do expect from these sprays mild thinning. It won't be aggressive. There'll still be a lot of thinning left to do when we get to 12 millimeters. Now, what about Maxellin 7 this year? So this year, with the temperatures in the mid 60s, Maxellin 7 at best will give mild thinning. And so we would often say, don't spray Maxellin 7 when temperatures are this cool. Well, they're at least not in the 50s, but Maxellin 7 has a wonderful effect on Gala. So even though it's a little more expensive spray than an NAA and 7 spray, I still would use it on Galas this year for the benefit on fruit size. I want to emphasize, don't jump the gun on this spray. Wait till fruits are closer to 6 millimeters. Now, from the fruit sizes we saw a few minutes ago from the Lake Ontario fruit team, only the inland sites and only with Ida Red are we getting close to the 6 millimeters. We're not there yet on any other variety. So that leads me to believe that we will be looking at the earliest petal fall sprays on inland sites starting next Monday, and could be Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday. Just check the carbohydrate model for that column on degree days and try to wait till you get at least 125 or even up to 100 or up to 125 degree days before spraying your petal fall spray. I have a few suggestions. I first want to announce and mention that the carbohydrate model is extremely useful to adjust both when to spray and what kind of rate. And I think you'll see that when you run the model on Monday, it's going to call for high rate. So that'll give you confidence not to put on a low dose of NaN7, the full 4 ounces. We're announcing that there is a slight revision to the carbohydrate model this year. And so what you see on NUA has those slight revisions incorporated into them. But the phone app, the Malusim phone app, to access the new revisions, you have to download the new version of Malusim for free from either the Apple App Store or the Android App Store. So I encourage you just to go ahead and get that downloaded before you need to use these models next week. I want to just throw out a small caution that if for whatever reason we got extreme deficits, which it doesn't look like we are, don't spray whenever deficits for the average 6 days is less than -60. Remember that at petal fall, all thinners have a moderate effect, and we proved this over a 17-year study. In no year did thinners applied at petal fall, even when temperatures are high, cause overthinning. So this year, especially with temperatures in the mid-60s, there's very little risk of overthinning. That's why I would like to encourage you to be aggressive with rates on this timing. Since there will be no significant deficit, assuming that the model correctly is predicting next week, we expect only mild thinning and hope that you will have confidence to move forward with full rates. I share again these 2 suggested thinning regimes for Honeycrisp and for Gala. I suggest for both of them that you spray a blossom thinner. I like ATS on Honeycrisp. I also like ATS on Gala, but I showed with the Gala how you could use NAA instead of ATS if you wanted to. But both of them have a petal fall spray on fruits are 5 to 6 millimeters. And that will be next week for both Honeycrisp and for Gala. With Honeycrisp, I like the full 4 ounces or 10 parts per million per 100 with a pint of 7. Whereas with Gala, I like this full rate of Maxellin 7 because it gives a boost in fruit size, even though here with cool temperatures, it likely will not give very much thinning. I have a few suggestions for you, and that is just gazing forward with the best forecast we have. It looks like the bulk of Western New York will be spraying their petal fall sprays starting Monday and Tuesday for inland sites, possibly Wednesday, but more lake sites Thursday, Friday, or even Saturday of next week. The weather calls for full rates. I repeat again, that's 3 to 4 ounces of NaA and a pint of 7 on Honeycrisp, Gala, or Snapdragon if they're mature. With Cortland, we like to leave the carbaryl out and spray only NaA. And if you spray Maxell, particularly on Gala, a full rate is 64 ounces per 100 dilute tree roll volume basis. Now, I want to emphasize that those rates are dilute rates. And I review with you all what we've tried for years, but I just put it on paper here so you can follow me. You must calculate tree roll volume for every orchard and then calculate a concentration factor. So the formula is tree roll volume divided by the volume of spray you choose to spray equals concentration factor. So let's use an example. For a tall spindle orchard that's fully mature, they measure out, if you calculate tree roll volume, usually around 200 gallons for a dilute spray. But let's suppose you're only wanting to spray 100 gallons to save trips filling up the sprayer. Then it's 200 divided by 100 gives you a concentration factor of 2. Now that concentration factor has to be used to calculate how many ounces of, say, NaA or ounces of Maxell go in each sprayer. Let's consider an example where you were putting on the 3 ounce rate for Honeycrisp. This year, I think it should be a 4-ounce rate, but let's just assume it's a 3-ounce rate. You multiply that by the concentration factor, that means that 6 ounces of NAA go in every 100 gallons of water. Now our sprayer holds 500 gallons, so that's 5 of these. So 5 times 6, that means 30 ounces of NAA goes in each spray tank. If you don't do this calculation, sometimes you're way under the amount of grams or ounces of the product that you need in each sprayer. Just really quick, although I didn't put it on paper, often for a full dose of Maxell at 64 ounces per dilute, and you have a 200-gallon tree, that's a full gallon or 128 ounces of Maxell per 100, and then times 5, that's 5 gallons in a sprayer. However, we don't generally recommend that you use the concentration factor for either 7 or any surfactants like Regulate. There, we just suggest 1 pint per 100, so that if you have a 500-gallon sprayer, you're going to put in 5 pints of 7, or if you're using Regulate, 5 pints of Regulate. I will comment about Regulate in just a minute at the end of this slide. My tips for success for this year are: assess every block for flower quality and bloom density. I think in this year, what I've seen so far, most kings are present, so use full rates. But if you have a block that was damaged and many kings are missing or damaged, I still encourage you to spray this Petal spray at the full rate, because you can produce a lot of way too many apples with just the laterals. Time your spray till we get enough heat units, 100 to 125 degree days. I like to suggest that you nozzle your sprayer differently for each spray. I've only listed here the bloom and petal fall. For bloom, I like a uniform nozzling from top to bottom, because our goal there is to cover the pistil of every flower with ATS. But once we get into petal fall spray, we often will overthin the bottoms if we use uniform nozzling. So we want to switch to the traditional nozzling arrangements, where 2/3 of the volume goes in the top half of the bank and 1/3 of the volume goes in the bottom half of the bank. Now, a comment or two about Regulate. Regulate is very common in the Western US. They have often much greater sunlight, and the leaves are harder with thicker cuticle, and they need Regulate. And it is known that Regulate increases the uptake of NAA, and so you get 50% more response out of NAA if you add a pint of Regulate per 100. I've been opposed to Regulate for most of my career, but more recently I've given these 2 rules, which I repeat here. If there is no carbohydrate deficit at petal fall, which is what we're expecting in 2023 next week, then I would include Regulate as a surfactant. But if you have a carbohydrate deficit, I would not include surfactants like Regulate, because you'll get too much response out of NAA. But in a case where we're going to face a surplus, daily surplus of carbohydrates, Regulate will allow more uptake of NAA and greater response. Now let's assume that you go forward next week and you spray your petal fall spray. How do you know how much thinning you achieved with both the bloom sprays, whether ATS or hormone type with NAA or NAD, from those 2 sprays? Well, the answer is to use the fruit growth rate model that Dwayne Green and Alan Laxo developed. It's an excellent tool to precisely understand how many fruits are going to fall off before you have to spray at the 12 millimeter timing. We generally measure fruitlets by hand using a caliper and run the fruit growth rate model on the MaluSim phone app, or even the MaluSim computer desktop app, which you can see at malusim.org. There's a couple of new ways to use the fruit growth rate model. One is a system developed by Todd Einhorn in Michigan called the fruit size distribution model, where you harvest 100 fruitlets and you weigh them one by one. And you do that twice after you thin on day 4 and day 8. And using his spreadsheet, it will calculate how many fruits are falling off. An alternative, which we're really excited about, is to use digital technology using either a cell phone or a digital camera from either Pometa, which uses a cell phone camera, or Orchard Robotics, which uses their camera, to scan the orchard with these digital technologies and measure fruit diameter a couple of times after spraying, and you can get an answer relatively quick. Now, the Pometa system is more developed and is fully functional this year, and you use it with a particular type of cell phone, an iPhone 14 or 13, and you use a video of the several trees in their system, and you can get fairly accurate results using the version of fruit growth rate model they have in their system. The orchard robotics method is still newer. We're still working with it this year. And I would encourage those of you who are working with orchard robotics to try what we're trying this year and see how well it works. If you still want to use the older method of measuring fruitlets by hand, you need to download the Malusin updated phone app from either the Apple or the Android app stores. And we have fixed the voice recording method in there so you can measure with the caliper and say the measurements with your voice, and it will record the results in the app. Once again, I would offer that if you want to use a fruit growth rate model and you do measurements and you have trouble getting what you think are reliable results, send me the data and I'll help you, and I'll interpret it for you and help you get used to using this method of estimating fruit set. Just a reminder that the typical waste for the last 7 or 8 years is to use a hand caliper and then measure twice, once at 50 degree days after application and a second time at 100 degree days after application, and enter the results either with your voice or type it into a spreadsheet on the Malusim phone app or on a computer using the Malusim app, malusim.org program. I show a picture at the bottom that we used to say you need to label each fruit and number them within the cluster. We don't do that anymore. You just measure them in whatever order you want to in each cluster. And the phone app has an automatic algorithm to put them in the right order. This is the results you get using the fruit growth rate model. And I put this slide up just to emphasize that in 2 weeks' time, when you're ready to put on your 12 millimeter spray, if you have this data, you will feel much more confident on what to do at 12 millimeters than if you don't have this data. This data was using calipers from last year. And you can see that in this orchard, we expected 550 fruits, which is the top pink bar on the graph. It says 550 fruits is what the trees should have carried. And we only wanted 120. So after the bloom and petal fall spray, the model predicted we had reduced the number of fruits to 226, but we only wanted 120. So we're still almost twice as many fruits, even though those bloom and petal fall sprays did accomplish quite a bit of thinning. We would then thin again at the 12 millimeters, but knowing that this was our job remaining to thin off about 100 fruits, it would guide us based upon the weather on how aggressive rates we should use. Before I end with this, I just want to throw this out again because some of you I may not talk to again before we get to this return bloom protocol that we're suggesting for Honeycrisp. We tested this and had really good results at 3 locations last year with better return bloom. And I showed the data at the bloom thinning meeting a couple weeks ago. Then we had with either NAA or nothing. So a Honeycrisp program would be at full bloom to spray ATS 2 times that we've already talked about. Then at petal fall to spray NAA and 7 at relatively high rates. And then the major thinning spray at the 12 millimeter stage with NAA and 7 again. But then a week after that spray to begin 4 weekly sprays of ethereal. The first of those ethereal sprays at 21 days after full bloom would be a half dose, a half pint of ethereal per acre. But when we get out a month after full bloom, we would switch to a full pint for the remaining 3 sprays. It would take us out to fruit sizes that are about 35 millimeters. This is when flower initiation happens in Honeycrisp. Last year, we compared this early approach to spraying ethyl, which starts at only 3 weeks after full bloom, versus the traditional timing that we've suggested of waiting until the last week of June to start. The last week of June didn't work. It didn't give us any return bloom improvement, but this early timing did. And this is supporting the data that Pollyanna developed when she was here, showing that Honeycrisp has flower initiation much earlier than almost any other variety. Hence, the return bloom sprays have to be sprayed earlier. I'm sure I'll repeat this at the next thinning meeting in person, but I wanted you to see it on the screen because when I describe it at the in-person meeting, maybe it won't make as much sense. But with that, I'd like to thank you for your participation today and end my presentation and open it up for any questions you might have.
Thank you, Terence. Folks can unmute themselves and ask the questions, or they can put them in the chat box. I'll be monitoring the chat box. No, it's Friday. It's been a long week of great weather. Folks have been out in orchards. Rain might be scrambled.
Terence, excuse me, Terence, Jimmy, what's
Yes.
the reference point for beginning the 100-degree days? Is that petal fall or bloom? I mean,
Yeah, it's 100-degree days after full bloom. Now, full bloom has a very specific definition. That's when
Right.
80% of the flowers on the north side of the tree are open. So that probably was for inland sites was Monday or maybe even Sunday, whereas lake sites
Okay.
it's much later. But it's 100-degree days after that.
thank you.
So I see a question from Pollyanna, and I appreciate it, Pollyanna. She's prompting me. One of the things that was very interesting on the data that I showed at the earlier timing was we also, instead of spraying ethyl for return bloom, sprayed Exceed. Now, Exceed is a chemical that makes ethylene in the plant, but in a controlled manner. Whereas when you spray ethyl, you're just spraying almost straight ethylene. It converts to ethylene very rapidly in a much more uncontrolled manner. Well, it turns out that Exceed worked wonderfully in these 16 to 20 millimeter timing to improve return bloom. And so it can be used. Let's suppose that we get in a situation where we don't get good thinning now at petal fall or at the 12 millimeter, and then we need a lot of thinning when we're at 16 millimeters. Exceed plus Carbohydrate has worked extremely well for thinning at this large timing. And the benefit is that Exceed will give us benefits in return bloom.
Another question, Terence. I think it's Mott's, or maybe it's their end users, has restricted ethopon for the use of ethopon. Supposedly won't accept any apples that have been treated with it.
Yeah, so that's a very difficult question, and I've been aware of that. And I personally think that that's an overreaction, and I hope they would reconsider. But if you're a Mott's grower, you have to be cognizant of their current restriction on any ethyl sprayed. I think the concern could potentially, because of Canada restricting residues of ethyl. But that's more using ethyl pre-harvest to improve coloring like we would do on Max in olden days. This very early timing of ethyl, I'm convinced, leaves no residue. But still, if that's a Mott's rule, it eliminates the potential use of ethyl for growers whose fruit might end up going to Mott's. Now, maybe it's a fresh fruit block, but some problems come up and you end up needing to send it to Mott's, and you've used ethyl, it might be a real problem. So I'm glad you brought that up because I had forgotten to build that into my presentation. So if you want, you need to be aware of that restriction. And then if you decide not to use ethyl for return bloom of Honeycrisp, an alternative that's worked extremely well is just Exceed by itself. So we sprayed 4 sprays of Exceed on instead of spraying 4 sprays of ethyl, and we got equivalent return bloom on Honeycrisp. So that's what I would say. If you, now many other varieties were not that committed to using ethyl to get repeat bloom, but Fuji and Honeycrisp do respond best to ethyl. And if you're not going to be able to use ethyl because you might be sending that fruit to motts, I would switch to Exceed for repeat bloom benefits, starting at 16 millimeters and then weekly sprays till you get 4 of them on after that 16 millimeter time for timing.
Thank you. Other questions, folks? Yeah, maybe they can clarify that for next year and work with the end users in Canada, because if you do use it at this timing for return bloom sprays, that I looked up the data, the residues, there's no way you could have residues at harvest. It's very frustrating.
My understanding, if I can jump in real quick, and
Sure.
we should try to get somebody from Mott's to really clarify this. But in speaking with them, I think that they have been very careful that their language is that there may not be any residue at harvest. So they're not straight up saying do not spray it. I'm pretty sure they're saying make sure that whatever you do, whenever you use it, as long as there's no residue. Pretty sure about that. Maybe clarify it to make sure. But that was my understanding of what they said to me.
Okay.
Great, thanks, Janet. But my comment is I don't want to be responsible for somebody's fruit to get rejected. So we're mentioning this. You have to be cognizant to deal with motts on whether they'll accept any apples that had ethyl at this early timing for repeat bloom.
It's a good question. Jim said there's still Honeycrisp in storage. Anyone sent in fruit to test? I doubt it. And I don't know why you would send Honeycrisp to a processor when it could go to a slicer. I know Grab Apple takes Honeycrisp. Cider makers take Honeycrisp. That would be my last resort. Nothing against the processors, but to send my Honeycrisp to a processor.
One of the snafus, Craig, maybe the college ended up going to
Gotcha.
a juice destination in Mott's or Canada, whatever. From whoever's making a juice. Going to Canada.
Another comment from Jill, concern is packing line calls. Good point. I didn't think about that. Well, great. I really appreciate everybody's participation on a Friday afternoon. So I will thank folks and thank Terence and thank Jim with the Hort Society.